Shri Shri Radha Madhav ki jai, Shri Bonnitai ki jai, Shri Shri Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman ki jai, Shri Nath ji ki jai, Shri Prabhupada ki jai. Omagnyanathmirandhasya jnananjanashlakaya chakshunmritam jena tasmai shri gurave namaha. Om namo bhagavate vasudevaya.
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 So, Hare Krishna, it's so nice to be here after 2 years. It took a lot of strength and inner will to stay away last year, and it's been a highlight each year to come here to New Jersey. After 2 years, it seems like a really long time, so thank you for having me back. The topic of the seminar is called Sanskrit for Scriptural Study, and the idea in the seminar, first of all, is not to teach anyone Sanskrit. This I say quite bluntly out in the front, because to study Sanskrit requires a minimum of 2 years of really consistent, intense effort. And for the vast majority of devotees, that is not only too much work, but is also mostly not very useful. For some devotees it is, and by all means I would encourage such devotees to pursue their studies, and I would be happy to help in whatever way I can. But this seminar has a more broad purpose and a more broad audience, which is to say, for every devotee who needs to study Srila Prabhupada's books, our scriptures, who wants to get a deeper understanding, there's a certain minimum appreciation of the language and a base of knowledge that is not only useful but essential. And there are a number of letters that Srila Prabhupada wrote to various devotees, but especially to Pradyumna Prabhu, specifically asking him to teach some kind of seminar on Sanskrit, particularly the pronunciation and recitation of verses, for the devotee audience, because Prabhupada said this is something essential for our Krishna consciousness, for our individual practice as devotees, and also for outreach to others. And so for both of those reasons, it's essential to know something. And this seminar aims to cover some of those basic skills that any devotee finds useful. And I would say pretty much every devotee picks up in an unsystematic way over the course of maybe a decade of trying to study Prabhupada's books. Prabhupada said that the reason I have put in so much effort into putting the Sanskrit into my books is so that anyone who reads them, he put the Devanagari, the Sanskrit letters, the Roman transliteration, and the word-for-word synonyms. And he was very particular about these being in all of his books. It wasn't an optional thing. It wasn't just a, kind of like an embellishment to his books to make them look more scholarly. He was really convinced that this was useful and important for devotees. And he said, the reason I put them in my books is so that anyone who reads them can learn Sanskrit through them. The essentials, at least. So this is kind of the purpose, the audience of the seminar. If you've come here looking for detailed knowledge of the language and how it works, then hopefully this will provide you some inspiration to go off after the seminar and actually dive into it. But it won't actually provide that content. On the other hand, if you've stayed away from the seminar, worried that it's going to be way too much Sanskrit that you don't need to know, then there's no need to worry, because I'm not going to go to that point. The types of things we are going to cover is pronunciation of the words in the alphabet, to use specifically for the purpose of learning how to recite verses of different kinds, especially the verses that we encounter regularly, how to recognize what meter they are in, what chanda, so there are different meters in which these verses are written, how to recognize what they are so that we can recite them regularly and properly in, say, morning classes, in our own study, how to appreciate the depth and the beauty of the language so that when we actually study those books, we can appreciate not just the translation and the purports, but also the verses that are included there, which allow us to go very deeply into both the beauty and the meaning of the scriptures. And then we'll talk a little bit about samasas, or compound words, because those are very useful for understanding the various names that we have for each other, but also for the Lord and the verses themselves. And we'll look at basic ideas of sandhi, or the combination of words and how words change, because once again, you can they're very useful in trying to break open these verses that we read and go more deeply into our study, whether it be through Bhakti Shastri or Bhakti Vaibhav, or just our personal study without any regular degree. So those are some of the things we're going to cover over the space of the weekend, beginning particularly tomorrow on Saturday for 4 hours, and then continuing for another 2 hours on Sunday. So over the course of those 6 hours, we're going to do that. Today, what I want to do is set up kind of the philosophical basis and hopefully the inspiration for such study, so that we kind of understand where it's coming from and why this is something that should be appreciated. Frankly, some Sanskrit in India today is kind of like Latin was a few decades ago in the United States, which is that most people hear of Sanskrit and they roll their eyes, either because they were forced to study it as young people in India, I think up to 8th standard or something, it's still required in India, and people just don't know the point of it, they get a headache, they get bored, or they know way too many people who are Sanskrit scholars who look down at them, and think that they're so much superior and they know all these verses, and you feel like a fool in front of them. So it's one way or the other. People often have a very negative impression of both the language and its purpose and meaning, and hopefully what I want to do is change that or soften that so that we see it as a resource and a great gift and a part of our heritage as devotees that we can be proud of and that we can appreciate as devotees. So that's kind of the idea for today's session is beginning that. Now, if I can just request the people in the audience, if you can just come forward a little bit, then this will give room for people who are trickling in later. It's a Friday evening, and so people come off work and so on. They won't have to find a space. They can just take a space in the back. So unless you have a good reason to stay in the back that involves health or something like that, kids, then you can please come forward. Thank you. Okay, so that's the plan for the weekend. It's something I look forward to a lot. This is something that I've taught for many years every year in Radhadesh in Belgium, where we have our Bhaktivedanta College. And it was a longer version of the same course there, more in a classroom environment, but it's something I enjoy teaching a lot. So that's the plan. Now, today, right now, we get started with the background and the inspiration behind it. I remember when my first child, Chaitanya, was born. So my kids were all born in Nairobi in Kenya, which is where my wife is from. She grew up, and when it was time to deliver the first child, she wanted to go back there. And so my plan was to get there in time for the delivery and be there for some time after that. But Chaitanya came early. She was excited to emerge out into the world and showed up before my plan. And I was flying international, so I couldn't change my tickets at the last minute and just hop on a plane. So it so happened at that time I was giving a seminar in Melbourne, in Australia. I was in the middle of the seminar, and I had a high fever. And so, I give the seminar during the day and then kind of become delirious at night and go to my room and try to sleep it off. And then one night I received the phone call, the news that that my wife was in labor. And it was very late, and I got the call, and I was wished her well, and my fever was rising, and I went to bed. And next morning I wake up, and I couldn't quite figure out whether I really heard the news that she was in labor or whether it was just some dream I had because I was in this half delirious state. And it turned out it was true. And she called me back in the morning with the good news that Chaitanya had been born. And I remember the first thing, after I talked to her, the first thing she did was put the phone next to Chaitanya. And I heard his voice. It was just he wasn't crying, it was just a little whimper, and I can't imitate it very well. But it was just, one of those little sounds that children make, babies, newborns. And I can still remember that moment. It was my first encounter with my son. Most people, most fathers, get to hold their son. It was their first encounter. But for me, I wasn't there. It was just his voice. But it was such a powerful experience. That voice I heard, it just instantly, the bonds of affection, of the tie, the knot in the heart that Bhagavatam speaks about, it was just there. It was just tight. And it's just, all of a sudden I felt this is my son, and I knew him, right? Just that small little whimper. And it was a very kind of emotional and very moving moment that I had. The first encounter with my first child. Now, the point being is that sound is a very powerful element in this world, right? It's when a child is born for the first time, when he emerges or she emerges, the child already knows its mother. It recognizes, they've done studies of this, that little boy or girl recognizes their mother instantly. And the reason they recognize their mother is not because she's familiar in terms of looks, because they've never seen the mother before. The way they recognize the mother is through her sound, through her voice. Because for 9 months, they've been listening to her voice. Whether she talks to the baby or not doesn't actually make a difference, because the child is hearing its mother constantly. And as soon as the child comes out, the mother's voice is so familiar and so soothing that all of a sudden that bond is clear. It's already made. It doesn't need to be created. And with others around, with the father also, they've done studies that if the father is regularly present during the pregnancy, the child recognizes the father and is visibly calmed and appreciates that presence. There was a parent I knew who used to watch TV constantly during pregnancy. And when the child was born, the only sound that would calm and soothe the baby was the sound of the television. Because that was the sound that he had grown up or spent 9 months in the womb listening to, right? So the point being that sound is very, very powerful. It's our primal sense. It's our first sense. And babies have very bad vision. I'm sure you know this. They have very bad vision when they're first born. They can barely see much beyond the actual face of the mother, and that too very hazy. And so sound is really part of their environment. It's the one thing, is the sense that they possess and they have even before they're born. They can't taste anything, they can't smell anything, they can't see anything, but they've got sound, and that sound is very Very important. In terms of the creation of this world, the Bhagavatam tells us, in the same way sound is the first element, first physical element that's created. After mind, intelligence, the ego, and the whole complicated Samkhya system, the first real thing that we can recognize that's tangible to us is sound, is the presence of sound. Sound and sky come together, and they're the first element of physicality within this world. When Brahma is first born, right, the seed, the lotus flower comes from Vishnu's navel, and he's born atop that. And can he see anything around him? No, he can't. Can he perceive, can he feel or touch anything? No, practically not. He goes down the stem looking for his source, his origin, and fails, right? Essentially, he's using his sense of sight and his sense of touch to find his origin, and he fails. He cannot. But his first moment of light after being born is what? When he hears the words, the syllables, tapa, which is a two-syllable order. It's an injunction, it's an imperative word, which means perform austerity. We need two words in English, but tapa in Sanskrit means perform austerity, do austerity. And that word, and he knows what to do. It's his birth, it's his initiation, so to speak. And from that, then, he starts to hear other sounds after austerity. The sound of Krishna's flute, the sound of the syllable Om, and ultimately the sound of the Vedas. Tene Brahma Hridaya Adi Kavaye. Through the heart, Krishna gives the sound of the Vedas. The point being that sound is crucial. And according to the Vedic idea of creation, sound is not, language particularly, meaningful sound, that is not a product of creation. It is an ingredient of creation. Language is required for creation to happen. The reason for that is because intelligence is required for creation to take place. Right? This is something that we all understand because pretty much everyone here is an experienced devotee. You know that the fundamental principle of creation in the Vedas is that intelligence came first, that there was an intelligent being. Ikshateya Nashabdam, Vedanta Sutra says. It didn't all begin with matter alone. There was intelligent life, there was an intelligence that designed everything and put everything into action. After that, there's a process of material evolution that happens from sound and so on. And that is the evolution of material elements. But that's put into process by sound, by intelligence, rather. The foremost mark of intelligence is language. The ability to use language is the full evidence of the presence of intelligence. Even when scientists study various different kinds of species and so on, when they see marks of language, of communication present, they know that, now we cannot dismiss those animals as mere products of matter. We can't dismiss them as mere objects of exploitation. We have to recognize those chimps and those whales and those elephants as being real creatures capable of showing intelligence, because there's signs of communication that are so obviously present in the way that whales and chimps and parakeets and all these other forms of animals communicate with each other in their own manners of language. Right? So language is, for the Vedas, an essential requirement for creation to happen. It's an ingredient of creation. It's not something that is optional, that comes later. And so you can't, according to the Vedic idea, you can't say that it was all, grunts and gagis and gugus, and then at some point people discovered how to say something. No. It's language starts first. Think about it. When you create something, when you invent something, when you discover something, what's the first thing you do? What's the first thing you do when you invent something? Or discover it, or find it as an explorer? Yes. Yes, but in the systematic process, you discover something. You go to a place that no one has ever been to before. Say you're an explorer. What's the first thing you do? Yeah, when you patent something, what's the first thing you have to do?
Take a selfie. To communicate.
You have to name it. First thing you have to do is name it. You give it a name. If you're unfortunate enough to discover a disease, you might have that disease named after you. Right? And so you get a name. This is, I don't know, this is Radhika Raman's syndrome or whatever. And if you discover a new place, then you name it. This is called Adam's Bridge, or it's called, John's Gulch, or whatever it might be. So every place gets, the first urge is to give a name. The Upanishads, they say this, that when the first being was created, the first thing he said, so we always hear what Brahma heard, but the first thing he said, the Upanishads say, is he said, it is I. It's here, it's me. And he said, oh, this is me. And therefore the Upanishads say that I, or aham, is the first name of all living beings. I, this pronoun. I am doing this. Whenever we answer the phone, we'd say, it's me, or it's I, right? Who's there? And we say our name. So the process of naming is the first step in creation. You find something, you name it, you categorize it. And naming is the first element of language. It's the ability to say I, or to give a name to something. That's the first step of language. Now, one thing to note through all of this is that notice that everything I've discussed so far has all been oral language. It's all been verbal. So far, nothing we've discussed, from the creation of sound according to Sankhya, to my experience and the experience of a baby when it's first born, to the process of naming, to all of these stories, everything we've described up to this point is oral, it's verbal. It's not written. It's not writing. Writing, according to the Vedic perspective, comes much later. It's secondary, and frankly, not all that important. It's kind of a derivative of sound. It is still hearing or reading, the process. 9 processes of bhakti, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smarana. Notice there's no pathanam there, there's no reading. And the reason for that is because reading is considered, if it happens, it's considered merely an inferior derivative of hearing. And specifically I say inferior because it's considered the king. The king in ancient times would be someone hopefully of learning, people like Maharaj Yudhishthira and others. But they wouldn't necessarily know how to read, how to write. They would hire some educated fool to read and write for them. It's like getting someone to fix your plumbing. Right? Why would the king fix your plumbing? Or why would the king set up the furniture? It's manual labor. Reading and writing was like that. It was manual labor. The word for writing in Sanskrit is likhati, which means to scratch, because that's how they did it initially. You get a palm leaf, and you have to take your pen, your quill, and you have the ink, but the ink needs to be scratched into it. You have to, when you write with it, it's sharp enough where it actually cuts through the fibers, not all the way, but superficially, it cuts through the fibers of that bark or that palm leaf or that homemade paper that you have to write it. So likhati means scratching, and that's manual labor. It's something that they would hire a scribe to do. Because language or learning is fundamentally oral. Sound is the most crucial thing here. And this is why the very first product of language in this world, namely the Vedas, that Brahma receives through the heart, are delivered orally. And for centuries after that, the Vedas are taught, are received and recited orally. orally, verbally, and orally through the ears, through the mouth and through the ears. And what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the Vedas. Now, when I say Vedas, I mean specifically the Vedas. Those sets of books that we always pledge allegiance to and know nothing about. It's those books that you can go all throughout India, and people will, if you ask someone, what does it mean to be a Hindu, for example, then people will say, it means to be a follower of the Vedas. And yet, no one knows what's in these Vedas. Not necessarily due to their own fault, frankly speaking. The Vedas, for the past, at least many centuries, 5-6 centuries, have been restricted in their usage to no one but Brahmin men. That's it. And so, people didn't really have an opportunity. But frankly speaking, as devotees, we are constantly speaking about Vedic culture, Vedic philosophy. It says in the Vedas, Sprite is not Vedic, like that. We have so many ideas of what is Vedic, right? But we have very little appreciation for what the Vedas are. Either we don't know, or when we do speak of the Vedas, we do so mostly to criticize them. Because the Vedas, Krishna says, Traigunyo Vishaya Veda. The Vedas deal only with the three modes of material nature. They're involved with karma kanda, with materialistic religion, and therefore they're no good for devotees. No, that's a fact. But frankly, before we dismiss the Vedas so quickly, which are the foundation of the entire Vaishnava tradition, grounded in the Vedas, and any kind of tradition born in India is grounded in the Vedas, whether it's Buddhism or Jainism, either in a positive way or negative way. Everything is grounded in the Vedas. They are the oldest written, or not written, but composed religious texts in the world. And before we dismiss them, we should know what it is we're dismissing. We should know the value behind them. And it's fascinating, the Vedas and how they were passed down. Scholars today, I mean not necessarily devotee scholars, will tell you that the recitation of the Vedas that we hear, that you can hear the boys at the Mayapur Gurukul school of Bhaktivedanta Purnamaya chanting, that Vedic recitation is the closest thing we have today to a 3,000-year-old tape recording. That's how precise, how careful, how perfect the transmission was of the Vedas. When we think of oral transmission, oral conveyance of anything, we tend to think of things as being really like rumor, wishy-washy and constantly in flux and not very dependable. That game, I don't know what it's called. Telephone, yeah. You tell something to one person, and it's out on the other end. You tell that person to tell the other person exactly what you said, and that person tells the next person, and so on. By the time it gets to the last person in the room, that whole thing has been changed, right? Heavily modified. It'll bear some resemblance, but it's very different in the details. And that's if everyone along the way is trying their best to be faithful to what is said and pass it down exactly. If there's some evil person in the mix who decides to change it, then, the whole thing's off, right? All bets are off. So we tend to think of oral transmission like that, unreliable, not very helpful, but there's a different mode to oral transmission that the Vedas were done with. That was more reliable than writing was or ever will be. You see, writing is actually a highly unreliable mode of transmission. We think that if we write something down, now I'll remember it, it's stable. If it's published as a book, now it's safe. But writing is actually a really unstable form of transmission, especially before the arrival of the printing press. Think about this. Before the printing press was invented, how would you get a copy of a book? If you wanted, I don't know, a copy of Bhagavad Gita as it is, what would you do? Well, what was your option?
You have to manually copy it.
You would have to sit there and manually copy the book. Right? Chances are you don't have the time to do that, or you don't have the expertise to do that, because it's a very difficult and painstaking process. So more than likely, you're not going to do it. You're going to do what?
Hire someone.
Hire someone. Hire a scribe to do this. Someone whose job it is to copy books. Just like if you need to print a book, you could do it in your home printer, but more than likely you're going to go to your local print shop and give them the file and print it. So in the same way, people would hire scribes to do this. Now, the scribe is someone who's paid to do it. This is not your, doing it for the love of it. So they're paid for it, and their payment is directly proportionate to what? What does their payment depend on?
How many pages they write?
How much they copy, and therefore if you're trying to copy as much as possible, you're going to do what? Copy it as fast as possible, speed, right? That's going to be your primary goal. Now, accuracy and speed in writing don't go well together. And so these scribes would make all kinds of mistakes. Some of them careless and others very genuine that they couldn't avoid. But they would make all kinds of mistakes in the transmission of these books, these manuscripts. Manuscript, manu means hand, like manual labor, and script means writing. So handwritten books, manuscripts. They would make all kinds of errors or mistakes in that process. Some of them were very genuine. Like if you've ever watched or taught a child how to read, just as they're learning, if they have multiple lines on the same page, they'll read a line, and it doesn't even, not with small children, even older children do this, even adults do it. You read one line and they look away for 1 minute because you're distracted by something, and you look back at the same thing, the same word where you left off, but 3 lines down. This happens. If you watch a kid read, sometimes they'll skip an entire line. It's called I skip. And you go from one to the next. You'll skip a line or sometimes skip 2 lines. Scribes, they have 2 books in front of them, right? One they're writing into and one they're copying from. So what are they doing? The whole time they're doing this. And where the eye lands each time it looks up, most of the time it's correct. Half the time it's not half the time, occasionally it's in the wrong place. And so you'll get words or chunks missing from what you've copied. Other times, they will misread what they're copying. Many of these scribes were actually illiterate. Can you believe that? They couldn't actually read. For them, it was a mechanical process of they learned the characters. They didn't know what they were writing. In other words, they learned the characters. It was just a matter of copy. So if you missed a word, you wouldn't really know what you had missed. And as a result, all these mistakes are introduced into the next version. By the time the person who commissioned the copying, you have had a chance to actually read the book, because this is something you read every morning as part of your religious practice. By the time you've noticed that there's a verse missing from the Gita, it's way too late. The guy's gone, you've already paid it. So you scribble something into the margins. The other thing you're scribbling into the margins as you're reading is your own notes and comments, your realizations as you're reading it. Now someone else, your friend, wants a copy of the Gita. So you lend them your copy. And that scribe has to make a decision whether the stuff you put in the side was actually stuff that was missed from the book and you were supplying it because the previous scribe had missed it, or whether it was your own realizations. And occasionally he'll stick your realizations into the original book. You can see what happens once you get to the 15th or 20th or 100th copy. one after another, you start developing a different version of the book that is still recognizable as the same version, but is different in many ways. Madhvacharya, the great Vaishnavacharya from the 13th century, he said that this process essentially is what happened with the Mahabharata. He said the Mahabharata is a problematic text. He used actually stronger words than that. He said it's a problematic text because we do not know what is authentic in the Mahabharata. There are so many variations in the Mahabharata. It's unbelievable. You know the story of Satyavati and Parashara Muni, how Vyasadeva was born. Basically, Parashara Muni is crossing the river. Satyavati is the boat lady, and he sees her on the boat, is totally attracted to her, and they have a child together, and that child is Vyasadeva. Now, this is the North Indian version of the story in the North Indian Mahabharata. The South Indian Mahabharata is significantly different. And South Indians are apparently very disturbed by the fact that Vyasadeva, the author of the Vedas, the compiler of the Vedas, could have been born out of wedlock, an illegitimate child. So instead what happens in that version is when he's attracted to her, they stop in an island in the middle of the Ganga, and all the devas come down, the demigods, and they perform a wedding ceremony for them all together. After they're married, then they have the act, then the child is born, and then the marriage is annulled after that. So it's a temporary marriage, just so Vyasadeva is born in a properly wed household, even if it's temporary. There are many, many variations like that, and things that contradict the Bhagavatam in significant ways. Like the character of Queen Kunti is very, very different than in Bhagavatam, in Mahabharata. Queen Kunti in Mahabharata is the one who comes up with the idea of burning 5 sons and their mother in place of her sons and herself in the house of lac, to make it seem like the Pandavas had been killed. So many, and you cannot imagine the Kunti Devi of Bhagavatam doing such things. The point being that many readers of Mahabharata, but most famously Madhvacharya, have recognized this problem, that things can change when they're written down over the course of time. Now, I should mention, before I destroy everyone's faith in the scriptures here, is that I should mention that with the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, these two have incredibly stable manuscript traditions. I think I've mentioned this in a previous seminar when I did on Bhagavatam, that the Bhagavatam is extraordinary for works of that age. That it's, and I know this from first-hand experience, because I've taken significant sections of the Bhagavatam and compared them with the critical edition, and we won't get into that, but through various manuscripts. And the variations are next to nothing. They're so minimal. They almost never affect the meaning. I would say, maybe just, it's practically not there. It's actually incredible. Same thing with Bhagavad Gita. This happens particularly when a work is treated as scripture and carefully read, studied, but most importantly, recited, memorized by a community of practitioners, of devotees. Century after century, variations are next to impossible. They're next to impossible. Just think of any kind of famous song that you know, that you've grown up with the words for. If someone gets the words wrong, you stop them, right? You know that's not the right words. Because it's used so often, right? Bhagavad Gita, people memorize entire chapters in India, if not the entire book. You'll know it if something is wrong, right? If something is different. But even there, you get slight variations. Have you ever heard Prabhupada quoting this verse, Janma Karma Chave Divyam? What does he say for the next line?
Jo janati tatvata.
Yeah, Yo Janati Tatvata. And his own book says, Evam Yo Veti Tatvata. The meaning is identical, and they both fit in the metrical pattern, but it's a slight variation in the wording, right? So even with the Gita, little things that frankly have very little effect on the meaning are present. So my point is simply to kind of destabilize this notion that writing is somehow perfect, it's somehow stable, that it's somehow eternal. And to help us appreciate more the value of the oral tradition. Contrast this now with the way the Vedas were recited and passed down over centuries, thousands of years, over millennia, in what is a precise and unvaried, no variance over thousands of years. The Vedic oral transmission process was nearly perfect. How did they manage that? Well, it's hard work, and it takes a lot of intent to do it, to let it not, devolve into this Chinese whispers or telephone situation. It takes a lot of effort. And this is how they did it. They used various kinds of techniques to ensure that the mantras were perfect. The first thing was, perhaps the most important thing, is that the Vedas are in meter. They're in metrical verse patterns. Now, we will define what meter means more carefully tomorrow. But we have a gut sense of what verses are. When you recite the Gita or any verse from the Bhagavatam, there's a certain rhythm to it, right? It's not just like a paragraph. There's a certain rhythm to it. That rhythm, that creates that rhythm, is the metrical pattern, the meter, the chanda that we are feeling as we read it. For us, the idea of reading verse or poetry is commonplace, but this is thousands of years ago, the first instance of written poetry. And from a historical perspective, if you look at the scope of what we have written throughout history, this is a huge innovation in the history of the world, right? The idea that you can write language in a pattern that has a certain rhythm. What happens when you add rhythm to anything? You can remember it much easier. We, as human beings, we are hardwired to feel rhythm. If you listen to a good beat, you can't help but tap to it. You can't help but feel it in your system, right? And if it has a good beat, you are much more likely to remember the words to it as well. There's just no question about that. So, metrical pattern helped in memorization. It's so much easier to memorize these verses from Bhagavad Gita than it is if I were to give you just 3 lines of straight Sanskrit. Trying to memorize a paragraph from a textbook, nearly impossible to do. But the lyrics to a good song with a good beat to it, easy to memorize. How many Hindi filmy songs do we have piled up in our brain? Songs that we may not even want in our head, but they're there. We can't get rid of them. Why? Because at some point we got it with the rhythm and with melody, with tone. Vedic Sanskrit had pitch to it. It had tones to it. You've heard the Vedic chanting before, right? By the Gurukulis or by a CD or by someone doing yajna. It always has this certain tone to it. Om Sahasrasesha Purusha Sahasraksha Sahasrapan, right? That has that tonal quality. That tonal quality is not just tradition. It's not just to look sophisticated. It's not just to make it difficult. It's actually required in the language. Vedic Sanskrit is a tonal language. That is, every syllable has a particular tone to it. It has an intonation. A high, low, or middle. Udatta, anudatta, or swarita. 3 different pitches And every syllable, Sahasrashirsha, where you go, whether you go or you go is determined. It's not optional. And to get the wrong intonation actually changes the meaning of the word. It's at best mispronunciation, at worst it changes the meaning itself. You've all heard Chinese being spoken, right? You know the sing-songy quality that Chinese has, why it's so easy for people to make fun of, right? Because it has a sound to it that goes up and down, right? And yeah, everyone laughs. The point is that Chinese is an intoned language, just like Sanskrit used to be. Whether you go or you go it changes the meaning of the word. And you can make a real fool of yourself by getting the wrong tone. Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, that is, by the time of the Bhagavad Gita, has lost its quality of intonation. It doesn't have pitches. But in the Vedic times, tone was present. 3 tones. Of all the different Vedas, there are 4 of them, Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharvaveda, which is considered to be the most beautiful. Krishna is praised by the singers of the Samaveda. You know why?
Musical.
Because Sama takes those 3 tones and it extends it to 5. And it becomes much more musical in its quality, more melodious. That 5 eventually in India gets extended to 8. And it becomes the octave. Sa, re, ga, ma, pa, ga, ni, sa, like that, the 8. And it gives birth to the rise of music in India. Okay? So this is one of the legacies that we have from the Vedic tradition that we use regularly, is the 8-note scale in India is directly a development of the chanting of the Vedic recitation. So metrical verse, add to that some rudimentary melody, and the verses become much easier to remember or to memorize. It's much more difficult to forget it. And just like we talked about these songs or lyrics. If you've got a good beat and you've got a nice melody, you're going to learn it. You're going to learn it. This is actually a very important tip for memorizing verses. If you're interested in memorizing Sanskrit verses, you need to always sing them. Create your own melody if you have to, but you have to sing them and you have to feel the rhythm. And if you can feel the rhythm, and that's what we're going to try to accomplish over this weekend, if you can feel the rhythm, you can memorize Brahma Samhita verses and longer verses just like that. You just have to feel the rhythm, and then it's as easy as memorizing your favorite song that you hear on a film or in a radio or anywhere, your favorite bhajan, just like that. That's all. So those 2 things. Then third, they literally memorize the Gita, the Vedas, in backwards and forwards, inside and out. The regular mode of memorization, which is reading left to right, but they did other methods as well. They put the Vedic mantras in different patterns. So if A, B, C, D are 4 words, instead of going A, B, C, D, they would recite it separately without sandhi, something we'll talk about tomorrow, A, B, C, D. Then they do different that's called padapatha. Then they do different combinations of them. So A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, where you back up one word before you go forward another word. Literally, that's called jatapatha. Literally, they would, like a braid. Jata means braid, like a woman's braid. So they would take the words and they would braid them in order that they would, in the end, they would know those words literally inside and out. Right? It's like trying to take to be or not to be, that is the question, and saying it backwards. It's tough, you know that line, right? But question, the, be, it's really tough to get it backwards. What to speak in some combination. They would memorize it like that in order to ensure that not a single syllable or word was lost. Meter, tone, patterns of memorization, and finally, they would use physical bodily movements to go with each syllable and each tone. If you ever watch a teacher of the Vedas teaching their student how to recite, how to learn the Vedas, they will use hand movements as they recite. There's a movement for the higher pitch, for the lower pitch, back and forth. And when the child is first learning, the teacher will put their head on the student's hand, and they'll move the head in different directions. Om Sahasra Shirsha Purusha Sahasraksha Sahasrapa. And the student's going like this, learning the Vedas. This is really effective for memorization. Not just because it's difficult, but because it adds a physical layer to your memory. It's a physical layer to your memory. Physical memory, the memory we keep in our bones, not exactly in our bones, but it's kind of like that. The memory of our bodies is much deeper and more persistent than the memory of ideas and concepts up here. Think about this. If you learn a verse and after you learn it, you don't recite it for another 3 months or 6 months, what happens? Poof, gone, right? You have to relearn it. It's not completely gone. There's traces of it, but mostly gone. Say you go to India for 6 months and you don't drive a car. You come back, land at the airport, you get in your car. Are you going to be concerned as to whether you know how to drive it or not? Which pedal is the accelerator, which is the brake? Even if it's a clutch and you haven't driven a manual for years, if you drove a manual before and you've driven one, you can get into a manual and you can drive it. Maybe a couple hiccups, but you can do it. Why? Getting on a bike after you haven't ridden a bike for months? Easy, no problem. Because physical memory is really deep, it's very stable. And so you add physical memory to the recitation, along with the tones and along with the meter, and along with the patterns of recitation, and it's practically indestructible. This is another tip if you're memorizing verses. Sing it, do it in a rhythm, and recite that verse, memorize it while you're doing different things. Don't just sit in one place and say, this is my spot to memorize the verse. Recite the verse when you're driving a car, when you're doing some work in the temple, when you're, doing whatever you have to, cooking or typing something. Recite the verse every occasionally. If you add different kinds of physical movement and correlate it with the sound vibration becomes stable. From a neurological point of view, you're creating different pathways to it in the brain. From the Vedic perspective, you're adding this physical memory that people have been doing for millennia in the Vedic tradition. So 4 things they would do. The 5th and final thing is that they would almost always recite the Veda in a group setting, or at least regularly recite it within a group setting. Then, when you've got 10 Brahmins all going Om Sahasra Shirsa, if you are the unfortunate one person who misses a syllable, everyone's going to go, what? What's wrong with you? Go study your Veda again. And the last thing that the teacher in the Upanishads, the guru, tells the disciple, there's a very ancient graduation speech in the Upanishads. This is graduation season for universities. And I was recently asked to give the graduation speech at my university, Utah State University. And I said, I'm going to recite the oldest graduation speech in the world that we know of. This is in the Upanishads. And the one thing that the teacher says is, make sure you revise your lessons, you review your lessons of Vedic learning, of memorization, because you're going to forget it, and the subtext is you'll make a fool of yourself when you go to recite with other Brahmins. So when you do it as a group, when you do it together, then the chances for variation are very little. Tone, patterns of memorization, metrical pattern, physical movements, and group recitation. With all of these put together, the Vedic transmission of knowledge was near perfect for thousands of years. Even then, there were problems, right? This is why Krishna says, evam parampara praptam imam rajarshayo vidu sakalene hamata yogo nashta parandapa. There's a problem sometimes that chain of transmission is broken. Then Krishna says, I have to come back to reestablish it. So even then, it's not perfect because no human beings in this world are perfect. But it's pretty good, right? Better than any other form of transmission that we know of in history. And even today, with the invention of the printing presses, the amount of errors introduced when I was doing math, we had a partial differential equations textbook that was in its 8th edition, because there were still mistakes in it that the professor would point out. This is printed, it's proofread by a whole team of editors at a major press, and still there are mistakes. So my point being that we should not discount the oral tradition. Receiving knowledge orally is something that is not very popular these days because everything is so visual and everyone is a visual learner. And that's fine. There's nothing against that. As a teacher, I have to use visual methods of learning. But the point is, we shouldn't discount the power of sound. And whatever tenuous grasp we still have on oral learning, we should hold on to it because it's valuable, it's powerful, and frankly, it's the deepest form of learning. I encourage you to listen to a lecture by Prabhupada and then read the same lecture in transmission and see the difference. It's the tradition of searching through the Vedabase to find a quote from Prabhupada in one of his lectures and cutting and pasting it is useful but also dangerous because we don't know what tone he said it in. But if you go to his recordings, you can hear the sound vibration. Not only do we hear what he meant to say, whether he was laughing or smirking or being sarcastic or being jolly or speaking to a particular individual or saying this off to the side to the devotee who was, if you had a transcription of the japa tape, right? Sit properly. How you wouldn't get the same, Prabhupada comes out and says, sit properly, right? That it has a certain impact. Whereas if you read sit properly, it would just be a generic instruction as you're reading, as you're chanting, sit properly. But this has a different effect. It wakes you up as you hear it. So the power of sound vibration is crucial, and we should not give that up. As boring as Bhagavatam classes might seem, right? The idea of actually sitting and listening to Bhagavatam without the book in your hands, the ability to hear the purport, to hear the speaker, to recite, well, okay, the board is there for the verse, but it's far away and you see a little bit. You have to rely on the ears also, and that's very important to preserve the quality of sound. The Vedas were passed down orally in this way. And what were they passing down? Mantra. Mantra. Now, this is a word that everyone's heard of before, not just the devotees here, but even if you go out into the public. Mantra is a popular word now in the English language. What does the word mantra mean? What is a mantra? I'm not looking for a literal definition, but what is a mantra in a generic sense? Not just the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra specifically, but a mantra in general. What is a mantra? What does it do? It's a sound vibration. Yes, it definitely has a powerful effect on the mind. What else? It's repetitive. Yes, exactly. It's something that you repeat. It's meant to be repeated, in other words, over and over again. What else?
There's a lot of value to improve your life. If you repeat it over and over, like this, make this your mantra in life, you'll be strong, or you'll be physically fit, or something like that.
Yes, it transforms, it affects those who recite it. A mantra is fundamentally, it's a specific type of speech. It's effective speech, a type of speech that is meant to have an effect in the world, to change something in the world. There are different kinds of speech, and linguists will tell you this as well. There's like descriptive speech. It's a warm day today. It's hot. That's not meant to change anything. No amount of complaining is going to change the fact that it's a warm day. It's merely a descriptive statement, right? There are different kinds of statements we make, but some statements have the power to and are intended to actually change something in the world. For example, when a judge is seated in the courtroom and is ready to sentence someone, he or she hits the hammer, the gavel, and says, before they hit the gavel, they say, I sentence you to 6 months in prison. Boom, boom. Now, that's not merely descriptive speech. That's not merely, oh, it's warm outside. That speech, those words, have the ability or will change that person's life, at least for 6 months, maybe for much longer. It's very powerful because it changes something in the world. Now, if I were to try to do that, right? If I were to sit here and say, Madan Gopal, you're sentenced to 6 months in prison, nothing happens. Right?
Descriptive speech.
It's not even descriptive, right?
Misleading.
It's, I don't know, hopeful speech, misleading speech, false speech, meaningless, right? But it's not effective speech. Why not? Why does my saying it not do anything?
Authority.
I'm not a judge, right? I have no position of authority. What else is a problem? Suppose that judge goes out to the middle of a street and says, I'm a judge, I sentence you to 6 months in prison. Will that person go to prison? No. He's a judge. What's missing? Yes, the context, the court is not present, right? Suppose that person, the judge, drags his friend over to the courtroom, sits him down, hits the gavel and says, I sentence you to 6 months in prison. It's a judge, it's in a courtroom. Is that person actually going to go to prison? No. What's missing?
Protocol.
There's no process that led up to it, right? There's no case, there's no plaintiff, there's no defendant, there's no lawyers, there's nothing, there's no context to that. Most importantly, there's no problem that he's trying to resolve or solve. The point is, all of those things put together make that speech effective or powerful. Mantra is effective speech. It is speech that is meant to change something in the world. And it can change something in the world. It can free our mind, it can transform our lives, it can produce meditation. It can do things even more powerful than that. It can kill people, for example. We read in Bhagavatam of how sages chanted mantras and poof, people were dead, like that. Right? It can do very big things. It can invoke the Brahmastra by a warrior. Sound is very powerful. We've already talked about that. Mantras are effective speech. But like any other form of effective speech, it needs context. It needs a proper environment. Who is chanting it needs to have proper qualification. That person has to be qualified to chant that mantra, has to be given that mantle of authority, just like a judge. The context in which you chant that mantra is very important. You cannot chant mantras fresh out of bed, except for mantras that are meant to be chanted fresh out of bed. But you can't. You have to be bathed and you have to be properly clean. You have to be in a clean space. Your mind has to be focused. You have to be qualified, you have to be initiated in order to chant those mantras. The Gayatri Mantra, for example, is randomly chanted as the mantra of Hinduism on loudspeakers everywhere. But the reality is, such chanting of mantras at best is useless. At worst, it's dangerous. We'll see examples of why it can be dangerous tomorrow when we talk about actual practice. But at best, it's useless. Why? Because it's that judge going around in the middle of this on the street going, "I sentence you," or it's me going around and saying, "I sentence you." Is the person who's reciting qualified? Is the listener qualified? Are they doing it in a pure physical state? Are they doing it in a pure mental state? Have the proper rituals been done before it? All of that, if it's done just right, the mantra is hugely powerful. It's essentially, to use another metaphor, it's a spiritual technology. And like any technology, it needs to be deployed with great care. A Hobart mixer in the kitchen or an automatic cutter for vegetables is really powerful and very useful, but only when used properly, right? If you stick your hand in it, it's dangerous. It's very, very bad. So any technology is like that, right? When properly used, it's effective, it's useful, it's even good. And when not, it's not. So the same thing is true with mantras. Now, this is, on a side note, this is the thing that makes the Hare Krishna Mahamantra so powerful and so special. When we hear Nam Nam Akari Bahudha Nija Sarva Shaktis Tatrarpita Niyamita Smarane Nakala. We take that for granted. We can chant any place, anytime. But we have to remember just how big of a deal this is. How much of a concession we're getting here. Because any other mantra, if you do Niyamita Smarane Nakala, if a Brahman, an initiated devotee, second initiated, tries to chant the Gayatri Mantra, Niyamita Smarane Nakala, it's really bad. It's offensive to the Gayatri. Right? It's a Vedic mantra that should not be chanted like that. Practically any other mantra. The fact that we get the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, Krishna's names, Niyamita Smarane Nakala, without attention to Niyama and Kala, to time and rules and regulations, that's a radical thing. It's a huge concession and a very big deal. It's like saying you can be the judge and sentence anyone, anytime, any place. You can go around chanting Hare Krishna in public and people's lives will be transformed. Right? That's a big deal. Right? And we see why it's so unusual if we understand what the Vedic tradition was and how different it is from the Vedic context. Right? It's really giving the power of transformation to every individual to transform their own lives and to go out in public and change random people's lives by chanting, which is not possible in the Vedic context. Right? It's actually dangerous if you try to attempt to do it that way. So the Vedas are mantras spoken in proper contexts, in the right situation. And what are they trying to accomplish by chanting those mantras? What are the Vedas trying to do through the power of mantra? If mantra is effective, transformative speech, what are they trying to do with it? Anyone know?
And elevate us to transcendence.
Actually, the Vedas are not yet concerned with that. By the Upanishads time, yes. With the Upanishads, they are. Those mantras are concerned with that. The Vedas are not concerned with transcendence as yet. What are they concerned with? What kind of change of life? It's actually something much more down to earth. The Vedas are concerned with maintaining with helping us live a good life in this world, a good material life, a comfortable and happy life by maintaining the proper order of this world. What do I mean by the order of the world? This idea of dharma. Dharma, we think of duty. But dharma at its most basic root means the order of creation, the order of the world. The sun rises and sets precisely on schedule, and we can predict sunrises and sunsets and solar eclipses 100 years, 1,000 years into the future. This tides come and go, seasons turn. Everything happens according to a particular order. When that order is messed up, when it rains on a holy day, right, then things go wrong. Our system says, no, this isn't supposed to happen. This is unseasonal, it's not right. We're not supposed to get a storm at this point. Maintaining that order in the world is something that doesn't happen automatically. We have to work for it. We have to work at it. If you have your own home, to maintain the order of the home, the water's running, the lights are on, the heating, air conditioning system, everything is running, you have to work at it. True? Yes? You have to work at it. And this is true of any kind of ordered system, because by nature, things tend towards entropy. They go bad, right, over time. If you leave your home, you leave anything, it goes bad. The world does that too. And so Vedic recitation, the purpose of it is to keep the world running, the world turning. And how do you do that? By paying your bills. If you want to keep the lights on at home, you have to pay the power company. And before the days of automatic debit from your bank account, you had to write a check, put it in an envelope, lick a stamp, and mail it out. And that simple act ensured that the lights would stay on. So Krishna, in the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita, he says, in this way, by cooperation between men and demigods, you sacrifice to them and they keep the lights on for you. The sun shining, the rain falling, as and when it's needed. Not too much, not too little. The winds are blowing. All those natural elements kept going. They keep those things going, and you offer sacrifices and pay bills. The most important element of that sacrifice, in the Vedic times, a householder was required to do daily yajna, daily sacrifice, in order to keep the world running. Your own life, no doubt, your own comfort, your families, but also more broadly speaking, the world, your village, your community, the whole world. The rain would not fall. This is why he was doing, Nanda Maharaj was doing Indra Yajna. Right? It wasn't a foolish activity. There was something more advanced to it, but it wasn't foolish. It was required. Even according to Gita, it's required. How many of us do those daily yajnas today? Every day. How many of us do that yajna, that payment? The most important element of offering yajna is what? Just after that verse in 3rd chapter, where Krishna says, in this way, by offering sacrifices to the devas, by cooperation between men and demigods, there will be prosperity for all. He explains the most important means of doing it. What comes right after that, which we quote pretty often? The most important means of doing that, Krishna says, is what? Yes. Yagnishishtasana santo muchyante sarvakilvishay. Bhunjate te tvakam papa ye pachante. Krishna says we have to. Ishtan bhogan hibodeva. He says we have to offer our food in sacrifice and then eat it. In other words, our offering of food to Krishna is hopefully an act of devotion. Krishna, this is yours. But even if you don't love Krishna, it's basic payment of your dues. It's basic payment of your sacrificial obligations. The Vedic sacrifice is a microcosm that will affect the macrocosm, which means the Vedic yajna is the small space, it's the model. And anything you do in the model, you offer the food into the small space, it affects the grander scheme of things. Your altar, you can offer to Krishna. Krishna is just yay big on your altar, right? Or this small on your altar. But he's the same Krishna. It's a micro version of the macro. The Vedic yajna, the sacrificial arena, is a model of the universe. And the Vedic Brahman, by offering that into the sacrifice, is feeding all the devas and all the demigods, giving their dues. It sounds like magic, but it's not. It's a spiritual technology. Just like that checkbook, in the days where we used to write checks, that checkbook is a microcosm. Right? When you spill ink, when you offer that ink into that little piece of paper and mail it out, someone who doesn't know is going to look at it and go, what are you doing? That piece of paper with a few letters written on it is supposed to keep your lights on? How does that work? But we know. I mean, you could go to the actual powerhouse and pay your dues there, but we don't do that. We offer it into the little model, into the microcosm, into the conduit, and that takes it to the world and keeps our lights on. In the same way, the Vedic sacrificial arena, our home altar, or the pot in which we're doing the chonk, that is all the microcosm into which we're offering our daily offerings. And that is how we pay our dues to the world, to the universe, to the devas, from whom we get, to the natural world, from whom we get water and air and light and heat and all of those things without ever asking for it. That is the idea behind chanting those Vedic mantras. Now, the beauty of the process of bhakti is if you offer with love for Krishna, you're already paying your dues in the same way. But if you're not a devotee, then Vedic offerings, essential. Essential. Every householder is required to feed everyone around. The animals, the birds, the ants, everyone needs to get their fair share. Otherwise, you're not paying your bills, and the lights will be turned off, or the rains will come so heavy we won't be able to handle it, like happened to the people of Vrindavan. Now, the problem is with the Vedic tradition. There's two problems with the whole Vedic model, despite its glories. The first is its goals. Krishna says, Traigunyo Vishaya Veda. The Vedas deal with the three modes of nature. They're dealing exclusively with material ends, material goals. How do I get good rain for my crops so I have enough food? How do I get good progeny so my line goes on, my dynasty lives on? How do I maintain good health, etc.? All of these goals are essential. There's nothing wrong with them. At the same time, they're limited because they do not solve the basic problems of the human condition, which is the four problems: birth, disease, old age, death, which is the problem of repeated samsara, of repeated birth and death, which is the problem of not being able to have an eternal permanent position in this world. They don't give us the lasting satisfaction that we're looking for in our hearts. So the goal is very narrow, it's limited, and therefore if someone gets eventually tired of the Vedas after Karma Kanda, they ought to move on to Jnana Kanda, towards gaining knowledge. Ramanujacharya, great Vaishnavacharya, he goes so far as to say that unless you know the Vedas, you cannot go on to get spiritual knowledge, and unless you have spiritual knowledge, you cannot get bhakti. So you have to be learned in the Vedas to get bhakti. Now, we don't say that, but at the very least, we can know what the Vedas are, so we know what we're giving up or moving beyond. That sort of idea of we are all into the Vedic worldview through our material activities, through our going on to our job and working hard and raising our family. We're doing what the Vedas are asking us to do, more or less. So the goal is limited. The second problem with the Vedas is that the technological sophistication needed to deploy this spiritual technology is so precise and so sensitive as a technology that we can hardly deploy it in our times today. If you take everything that I've put together, that was just the oral part, if I were to spend the next hour, which I won't, explaining to you the physical part of creating the Vedic sacrificial arena and the various implements and things that you have to put into it, I think anyone who's not already convinced would be 100% convinced that it's not something we have the time or space to do. The reason the Vedic tradition is dying in India is because it requires full-time effort from the age of 5 into your adulthood to learn the system in the process. The system of setting up the sacrificial arena was so precise that it was the birth of geometry in ancient India. And geometry was where ancient Indian mathematics came from. So everyone knows how mathematics in ancient India was so advanced, right? We hear about it, there was even a movie created about it, and so on and so forth. People know this idea, but it comes from the Vedic tradition. It comes from just the idea of trying to create the proper geometric shapes and measurements to create the sacrificial arena. That's how sophisticated it was. You put all of that together, and then the dangers connected with mispronunciation, getting that tone wrong, and all of a sudden you realize, this isn't going to work. Right? This isn't going to work. The Brahmins were supported full-time their entire lives just to maintain this tradition for centuries, for thousands of years precisely. And now it's maintained in some pockets, but gradually dying off. Because in this age, it's not recommended, not really possible because of the dangers connected with it. At the same time, despite that, the power of sound and of mantra has not been lost. It's not that because that is gone, therefore sound is now less powerful than it was at the beginning of creation. It is just as powerful. And today, we receive that sound through 2 mechanisms. Through the various mantras that we learn, because those mantras are still there, and through Shastra, or Scripture. Those 2 are the means through which we receive that chain of spiritual sound. It descends to us today. And does it not behoove us, therefore, at the very least, to try to connect with that tradition of powerful sound as well as we possibly can? To try to pronounce, to relish, to appreciate, to understand the meaning of those sound vibrations, if they are in fact as powerful as we have been discussing they are. And that's the purpose, that's the goal of this seminar, is to help us essentially understand and appreciate the power of spiritual sound as it comes through us, to us, in the form of mantra and shastra, through sacred utterances and through scripture, through those 2 mechanisms. If we cannot get it right in terms of pronunciation, the good thing is that in the process of bhakti, it's okay. Because Krishna, he looks for the intent. And so it still works just fine. So the first thing we're going to do tomorrow in this seminar is the first section of it, in the first session tomorrow, is I'm going to explain to you all the reasons why you do not need to know Sanskrit, okay? And not only that, all of the reasons why you shouldn't learn Sanskrit. Not only do not need it, why it can actually be really bad for you. And at that point, then, if you want to leave the seminar, you're welcome to. But I encourage you at least to come for the first session, so you can be totally convinced that this seminar is not worth listening to. Okay. Thank you all so much for your attention.